There we go. One more time then. Tavares Mathews, Hellenistic, Haustafeln, and the New Testament.
Again, I'd like to thank you for this opportunity to present this presentation. Again, my presentation will be Hellenistic, Haustafeln, and the New Testament. The term Haustafeln, of course, comes from a German word which means house tables or house codes. Haustafeln refers to household rules that appear in the writings of Paul and Peter. The term obviously was coined by Martin Luther when he translated the New Testament in one of his headings over Ephesians chapter 5. He placed the term Haustafeln. These rules instruct members of the household about appropriate behavior within the household. The Haustafeln consists of relationships between the husbands, the wives, the parents, the children, the masters, and the slaves. These passages provide a significant understanding of the role of women in the home and also in the church. Overall, it instructs us on how we should behave in the Christian community and how we should interact with one another. Obviously plays a pivotal role in Paul's theological teaching. The purpose of the ancient home was basically primarily a place of production rather than consumption. In other words, every person had a role within the home, whether you were as we'll look at the paterfamilias, or the wife, or the slave, the master, and all. Sometimes those terms will interchange with one another, obviously, except for the slave. Aristotle is the person who we think dates back to the person who delineated those particular terms. He says in his Politics, he says, the investigation of everything should begin with the households, the smallest parts, the primary and smallest parts of the household are master and slave, husband, wife, family, children. He says we ought to therefore to examine the proper constitution and character of these relationships. I mean the mastership, that of marriage, and thirdly, the progenitive relationships. Aristotle's view of women and children, he said that the slave, as relates to the subordination of women and children in light of their capacity of soul, he says the slave has not got deliberative part of at all. The female has it, but without full authority, and he says the child has it, but it's undeveloped. The household codes can be found again throughout the Greco-Roman period. You have individuals like Cato, you have Seneca, you have other individuals like Philo of Alexandria, Josephus, Epistle of Barnabas, the Didache. These are places where you'll find similar things as relates to Paul, as relates to the husband, the wife, the slave, children and parents, and so forth. Now, what's interesting is, in the Greco-Roman writings, the husband appears to be the master endowed with significant authority to explain the laws to his wife, father to teach them to his children, and master to his servants. The inferior classes are not addressed directly. In other words, when you look at those, as we will look at and juxtaposed to the writings of Paul and also Peter, these Paul and Peter actually addresses directly those, each person, the master, the slave, the parents and the children, and so forth. The purpose of marriages. There could be no family, obviously, without marriages. Most marriages were not for love, as opposed to today. Obviously, sometimes people did, there's no absolute, sometimes people did marry for love, but commonly they were arranged for political and social financial reasons. In other words, to get your standing in society, a better standing. Pompey, he obviously married his daughter to Julius Caesar and so forth, and there's always about trying to get your position in society. The state played little or no part in marriage, and obviously, as time progressed, there's a couple of documents. One, as it relates to Caesar Augustus, who wanted to promote marriage. He made it a law in which, and it's primarily dealt with the upper echelon, if you will, of society, where he wanted to make sure that they stayed married. And obviously, it was for financial reasons. But most marriages were simple. They were private affairs, while others were more elaborate and expensive. Basically, a couple was married if they claimed to be, and divorced if they said so. Brides, obviously, the father had to provide a dowry. However, the husband was obligated to return it to the marriage if they ended in divorce. There wasn't a specific reason why a person could get a divorce. Cicero, after several years of marriage, he divorced his wife. It simply ended it. He married a much younger person, young lady, and also it ended as well. Everett Ferguson, he delineates 3 reasons as relates to the headship of a woman, where he says 3 ways she would become under the headship of her husband. One was obviously through a marriage ceremony. Another one was through the sale of the woman to her husband. Thirdly, if they live for a year continually, they would be considered married. She would come under the headship of him. But he also mentions, and this he says was progressive way as it relates to how it normally was. He says in other cases a woman remained as a part of a husband's family instead of entering her husband's. In other words, the woman will always typically have a head. It would either be a husband or it be her father, as we'll look at. The paterfamilias, whether there was a king, a council, or emperor that stood supreme over Rome and its territories, the one constant in Roman history was the family. Like many earlier societies, the family was the central unit, and at its head was the father. And if there was no father, the eldest male, the Latin expression paterfamilia, he was the head. Sometimes people use the interpretation, when 1 Corinthians chapter 14, where it talks about a woman being silent. If she has any questions, ask her husband at home. Sometimes people say it's not necessarily it's the husband per se, or it could be whoever the head is of the particular family, whoever that head is, that man is in the family. The examination of each member of the household. We'll look at the man, the woman, and the children, and also the slave. In the Roman family, the male head of the family exercised absolute control over his wife, over the children, over the slaves, in fact, everyone that lived under his roof. Now, technically under his roof, but also it didn't necessarily mean under his roof that lived technically under his roof. All those that were under his charge, that was in his family, in his tribe, if you will, he had control, absolute control over them. That power extended also over their property as well, even after they left the house. He had to provide food and care for all those under his control, whether it was slave or free, and expected to give monetary allowances to his workers. This takes me back to 1 Timothy chapter 5, where he talks about Paul in the context of widows. He says if a man does not care for his family, that is those in his own house, he's worse than an infidel. And so the point here is the paterfamilias was one that took care of his family. There would have been no state-required responsibility. There would have been a state-required responsibility for the father of the household to have main authority like a manager over a business. Now, as it relates to the woman had little or no say as it relates to marriage. Marriage would be to a much older man. Sometimes the woman was 12 years old. Sometimes they were 15, and obviously upwards. And the male obviously was always typically much older than her. That's why you'll have a lot of cases where a woman will become a widow, and that perhaps gives us some type of context as it relates to 1 Timothy chapter 5 when he talks about the widows, and he talks about a young widow refused to let them marry. To go be counted in the number because after she gets older, she may marry someone. And so we have here that women always married at a young age. And also, if you keep in mind, when the case with Mary, the mother of Jesus, we sometimes think that she was obviously a teenager, Joseph much older, and what we have there is later in Scripture we don't have any reference of Joseph, perhaps because he had already passed. And obviously all of these are not necessarily absolutes. Within the household, women generally lived under the authority of her husband, the paterfamilias. But within this structure, wives also authorize or occupy a position of authority themselves. Women were responsible for the inner workings of the household, which might include some of the production of the family business. Women in well-situated households would have commanded the slaves and who lived and worked inside the home. So also women could also, in some contexts, if there was no male, be the paraphernalia as well. The household was obviously the domain of the woman. The women were masters in some cases. So sometimes we have this overlap here. We talk about the master, but generally, obviously, generally speaking, it would have been the male. But a woman could be the master as well. So you have that overlap. Where there's no male, she could function as the paraphernalia. Women were sometimes in charge of a considerable amount of wealth. My mind again goes to Luke chapter 8. Where you find that context where it talks about women. It lists several women, and they took care of Jesus out of their means. So again, we see here that they were women of wealth. Children were obviously expected to remain obedient to their parents throughout their lifetime. When we think of the Ten Commandments in Exodus chapter 20, sometimes the question is raised, is he talking about smaller children or adult children? I would tend to say adult children, but I would think it would apply to all children. But here we find that children were basically possessions of their parents in Greco-Roman culture. Fathers possessed great power over their children even after the children became adults. And so the paraphernalia always ran everything. They ran everything. Though many frowned upon the practice in the first century, infanticide was something that was very common. In other words, if you did not want this child, especially you're talking about individuals trying to provide for these children, they would expose them. In other words, they would put them side the road. Sometimes they'll place them in garbage heaps, if you will, dung heaps, and they would be exposed. Sometimes, though, people would know where these children would be, and they would go out and get them. They would be raised as slaves. But as we see here, Justin Martyr and Clement of Alexandria looked at that and said you need to somewhat be cautious about that because of incest. In other words, even though men were to be faithful to their spouses, that did not mean adultery was characterized as having sexual relations with another married woman. As we'll look at, that did not mean that it could not have sexual relations with slaves and also prostitutes. Slaves obviously had the fewest rights of all people in the household. Ancient slavery was not racially based. People often became slaves, obviously, when there was a war and they were taken captive. Men were born into slavery because children born to slave women automatically became the property of their mother's owner. A child or a person may sell themselves into slavery to pay off a debt, and also individuals who were taken to slavery for punishment by the courts. Aristotle spoke of slaves as being living tools. In other words, they were less than human. And they were obviously, on many occasions, just characterized as a body who served a function. Nancy Glancy, she talks about this particular example where she says, sometimes in the 4th and 5th century, a Christian man ordered a bronze collar to encircle the neck of one of his slaves. The inscription on the collar reads, "I am the slave of Archdeacon Felix. Hold me so I do not flee." Although the collar purports to speak in the first person for a nameless slave, the voice we hear is not that of the slave, but that of the slaveholder. Felix, enraged by the slave's previous attempts to escape, ordered a collar both to humiliate and to restrain another human being whom the law classified as his property. The chance survival of this artifact of the early church recalls the overwhelming element of compulsion that operated within the system of slavery, which is used with its use of brute paraphernalia for corporal control. Now the point here is that she paints the picture of this Archdeacon Felix did not have a problem with being a master and being a Christian. In other words, being an owner of a slave and being a Christian. And she juxtaposed this between the story of Philemon and Onesimus. Onesimus fled from Philemon, not sure the reason, not necessarily because he was being abused, perhaps because he was just a slave and wanted to flee, whatever the case may be. But we know he's in Colossae, he flees to Rome, he meets Paul, he becomes a Christian. And when Paul writes to Philemon, he says, I want you to receive him not so much as a slave, but as a brother. Now, he did not, it was not a compulsion or trying to compel him to do it, but rather by persuasion. But nevertheless, she supposes Archdeacon Felix did not have a problem with this, but we find here that Paul is trying to reverse this. Now, slavery, and nowhere in Scripture do we find anywhere where Paul or any other writer condemned slavery. As we'll look at, slaves were also viewed as sexual property of their masters, and obviously this could pose a great challenge to Christians trying to maintain their sexual purity, because again, the master had, as being the master of this particular slave, could go into this woman anytime that he wanted to. All right, because this was his property. She was viewed as his slave. Slaves in the Roman Empire were obviously vulnerable to the physical control of coercion, abuse in settings of as public as the auction block and as private as the bedroom. This is Glancy again. A male slave had no legal connection to his offspring, excluding him from the cultural status of father, because the child that was born to him actually belonged to the master. Slaveholders were had unrestricted sexual access to their slaves, and the dimension of slave life was most likely to affect female slaves and young male slaves. Now, why was that? Obviously, female slaves because they are the opposite sex, but also young male slaves because what we view as homosexuality. If a young male slave had any type of facial hair, they would shave that off so they can look more effeminate, so they can be viewed for the sexual pleasure of their master, whoever owned them. In the New Testament, we have several places where these household codes are found. The one we're going to primarily deal with is Colossians chapter 3 at this particular time. As I mentioned, Paul addresses each person individually. He says to the wives, submit to your husbands. Husbands, love your wives. Children, obey your parents. Fathers, do not provoke your children. Slaves, obey your masters. Masters, treat your slaves with respect. And so he addresses them directly. Now, you didn't find that in the Greco-Roman writings and other writings. It was the job of the paterfamilias to address them. But here we find that Paul addresses them individuals, indicating that they have moral constitutions about themselves. In other words, they have to make sure that they live a life pleasing to God for themselves. It is again notable that the children and slaves are addressed directly, which was again unusual in Hellenistic and Roman society. Usually only the male free adult was addressed. It is also notable that in Paul's writings, which follow the structure of the Roman household codes exactly, and not in every single case exactly, but it's how he has modified and toned down the degree of dominance of the husband, the father, the master over his wife, over his children, over his slaves. No longer is his authority absolute, but is limited and modified. In other words, the paterfamilias would have absolute control over everything that happened in the family. In other words, the wife did not have any say, the children did not have any say, the slave did not have any say. But here he makes it that each person should be viewed with mutual respect, as we will see. The power and position of the paterfamilias is still sustained and legitimated, yet regulated and subjected to obligations. He must be a loving father, a loving husband, caring and non-provocative father, and just and fair master. The consistent appearance of admonishment to the wife and slaves in each of his set of household codes signifies the importance of their behavior for the church communities and society. In other words, how he addresses them, that is the wife, the women and the children and the slaves, again, because they're living in a society that is wholly given over to paganism, if you will. One writer said the Roman era was a time where there was nothing but God. It was a world full of gods. And the paterfamilias, as we'll look at as we come to a close, will be that every person in the house served the exact same God. In other words, you could serve other gods, but the paterfamilias, everyone in the house served the same God. So if that is the case, that could pose a lot of problems for individuals that became Christians. The household code instructs churches members about how to behave in the public eye so that the church's life and that of its members can be sustainable. The church provided a space in which members of lower classes, that is women, could experience a real leveling and even reversal of social status. The New Testament house codes addresses the subordinate person in each of its parts. Thus, it speaks to them as moral agents. In other words, they had a role that they had to play as moral agents in the family of God, who were responsible for their conduct within the limits imposed by the subordinate position in the social structure. In succession, the code addressed the three relationships within the household. Each time it addresses the social inferior before turning to the more powerful. Tension within the house. Tension within the familiar framework was even more strained when the head of the family was an unbeliever. All right, and again, your mind may go to 1 Peter chapter 5, where it talks about if a wife has an unbelieving husband, he says, no longer focus on trying to convert him by using the word. Yes, use the word, but by your lifestyle. And by your lifestyle, you may be able to, by chance, convert him. Especially, again, since the whole family, the wife, the children, the slaves were to worship the exact same God or the head as the head of the family. Remaining faithful to God in these situations could be challenging to the Christians in the home. Some points to consider as we hasten here. The phrase "as fitting in the Lord" reveals the full meaning or the exhortation. This phrase must be heard as a message to wives who have unbelieving husbands as well. Wives of unbelievers must continue to obey their husbands if they and the church are to survive. In other words, if the church is going to survive, the wife has to make sure that she plays a role as a submissive wife and not bucking against her husband, because again, you could bring undue tension on the family and also on the church as well. As it relates to the husband in Colossians chapter 3, he says the second part of the command to the husbands enjoins them not to be embittered or harsh toward their wives. This is strange exhortation if the code sustains the traditional structure of the household. If wives submit and husbands command, then it is the wives who might be embittered and not the husbands. The injunction makes best sense in the context of reorientation of the household. It suggests that if the husband is no longer the lord of the household but lives with his wife in mutual submission, the relative lack of power might well generate bitterness within him. We have this submission type language in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 in the context of marriage, where Paul says the wife does not have authority over his own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Children obviously must obey their parents, and there's a proper way to conduct themselves in relation to their parents. And obviously this would prove problematic for children within the church if their parents are not Christians. Unbelieving parents may forbid or at least oppose participation in the church for both minor and adult children. However, this would have to be a command that these children would have to not obey. Again, as it relates to children, fathers should relate to their children in ways that do not lead them to be discouraged. And bitter literally means to arouse, usually in a bad sense to provoke. Paul refers to the constant nagging and belittling of children. Parents' duty is in effect to live out the gospel to his children. Continual harassment from a parent could be difficult to bear and might cause a child to abandon the church. So your objective is to try to live with that child in a way that would promote that child to want to continue in his station as a Christian, because it's already hard in society being a Christian, and you shouldn't make it more difficult while Paul says while they're in the home. Thus, a father should relate to their believing children in ways that help them remain faithful to their children. And obviously the opposite is also true. Children who had unbelieving parents should obviously follow their father's directives so that the church would not be blasphemed and so forth. The letter to the Colossians addressed slaves at greater length than any other group within the household. Perhaps this is because there were so many slaves in the church, or because it was harder for them to continue in their subordination after the incorporation into the community, proclaiming that the relative status of slave and free is insignificant. We have here in Paul, again, in the context of marriage, where he talks about Christians or people, when they become Christians, stay in the state that they're in. He talks about if you're circumcised, remain circumcised, if you're uncircumcised, and so forth. But in the context of you talking about slaves, he says in verse number 20, each one should remain in the condition in which he's called. Were you a bondservant when you're called? Do not be concerned about it. But if you can gain your freedom, he says, avail yourself of the opportunity. So he says he does see obviously an advantage if you are given the opportunity to become free. In conclusion, Paul indicated that wives, children, and slaves are to be submissive to their counterparts. However, the dominant roles are also called to be submissive to the lesser. Paul calls for submissive husbands, submissive parents, and submissive masters. This went against the grain and the norms of society. Although the household codes are similar to those of the Hellenistic Roman society, the underlying significance is drastically different. The New Testament codes call for mutual appreciation in all and support of all, no matter one's class or station in life. As Paul says in Galatians 3:28, there's neither Jew nor Greek, there's neither slave nor free, there's no male nor female, for we're all one in Christ Jesus. I know I ran through that pretty fast, and I know y'all slow down, but thank you.